Let me begin by thanking the Constitutional Center for the opportunity to participate here in addressing you alongside these respected colleagues and friends. Now, since 90% of what I know about the Little Sisters case, I just learned from listening to Matt Frank and his very lucid and even dramatic presentation, I'm going to frame some remarks taking off from Michael Zuckert's talk, in which he does an excellent job of bringing to light ambiguities and tensions that have always been at work within the idea of religious freedom. He is certainly right that there is no pure theory of religious freedom, which, if we could only grasp it and make it universally accepted, would resolve all the controversies surrounding the relations between religion and politics in the contemporary United States. Certainly there is no such pure theory, somehow to be uncovered in the original meaning of the Constitution or in the unified mind of the founders. Still, this justified skepticism regarding a pure and original theory of religious freedom in no way absolves us from the obligation to learn what we can from the founders', dare I say, wisdom regarding a wholesome and viable understanding of religious freedom. Times have changed, and the problems we face are not at all exactly those faced by Madison and Washington, for example. But if we think there might be some constants in human nature, some permanent features of the human condition, then it's possible, at least, that the founders saw some things more clearly than we now do, generally, and that we ought to be interested what these things might be. Is there any stable wisdom underlying the intersection of agendas that Michael Zuckert has uncovered? Is there any insight we might recover that could provide a key to preserving freedom of religion against the obsolescence of freedom for and the aggressive secularism of freedom from? A key premise of Michael Zuckert's is that, quote, the Lockean doctrine of the contractual basis of political authority is largely independent of Protestantism. Now that would be worth pondering. The suggestion seems to be that beneath the Protestant confusion, there is a clear and rational doctrine first formulated by Locke. Thomas Jefferson knew what he was doing, a Lockean program largely, and this knowledge can inform our judgments, whereas his Baptist allies who saw separation as in the interest of the flourishing of religion were, in a way, dupes to a rational Lockean program. Actually, I think there is some truth in this perspective. But one can ask further, did Jefferson himself really know what he was doing? He who was confident of the imminent sway of Unitarianism in the new nation, or even Locke, is the world he helped to create just as he intended. In any case, the result for Michael Zuckert is that, quote, laws with what we have come to call valid secular purposes trump religious practices to the contrary. Further on, Michael describes religious freedom as an offshoot of liberalism, by which he means this rational and secular liberalism. Since rational liberalism is the truth of freedom of religion for Michael Zuckert, it is hard to distinguish it in theory, if not in practice, from freedom from religion. Freedom from is the pure and clear form of freedom of. Freedom from thus tends to be more doctrinaire, I'm quoting now, freedom from thus tends to be more doctrinaire and rigorous than freedom of, and much more prickly about intermingling in any form of church and state. Now, Michael and I agree, I think that freedom of is more promising and helpful in many respects, but freedom from is not only more doctrinaire, but more rigorous, and thus has a kind of logical advantage in the long run, I would dare say. The key point of convergence between freedom from and freedom of is the conviction that all legitimate state purposes are rational and secular. But the problem, I would say, is that what we now call secular may be said in our times to have left behind the rational as Locke and Jefferson might have understood it. Locke's idea of rational government was closely tied up with limited government, whereas now a secular view is widely taken to imply a practically unlimited view. Obviously, the overlapping of rational and religious purposes that prevailed under freedom of was greatly facilitated by this earlier Lockean limitation of the rational considered as a ground of limited government. But once the secular has taken leave of the rational and limited, then it is fair to ask whether secularism does not operate practically as a secular religion, shaping institutions, habits, and beliefs to its own communion. Michael asks, does school prayer, when students have a readily available way to opt out, nonetheless coerce via the subtle social pressures that can be brought to bear on a dissenter? I ask, mustn't this question go both ways? Does not the allegedly secular, if not so much rational, governmental purpose of boundless non-discrimination, legislation, or court rulings, does not this allegedly secular purpose, for example, clearly shape souls, as must any established orthodoxy? Given the pronounced drift of secularism away from the limiting framework of Locke's rationalism, is it not fair to ask who is closer to Locke's views today among today's partisans, or who shares with him and with our more separationist founders a fundamental insight into the conditions of religious freedom? Can one identify the views of Jefferson and Madison, for example, with today's secular position? I think this is problematic. Jefferson and Madison both favored separation precisely because they saw it as the surest means to encourage a society's vital interest in permanent truths. Thus, Madison's view, as stated in his famous Memorial and Remonstrance Against Religious Assessments, which was circulated in Virginia in 1785, Madison's view that government should stay out of religious questions altogether, was based on the priority of man's, quote, duty toward the Creator, to the priority of that duty to any claims of civil society. Madison was more opposed to governmental support for religion than many of his founding colleagues, precisely because he believed that the joint prosperity of religion and civil society are best secured by their strict separation. Madison's rhetoric is indeed more progressive than was the norm for the founders, as is clear in his enthusiasm for, quote, quoting again from the Memorial, leveling as far as possible every obstacle to the victorious progress of truth, unquote. But it must not be overlooked that Madison continues to associate this truth towards which progress tends with, quote, the diffusion of the light of Christianity. Certainly not Winthrop's Christianity, but still. I have a little ditty on, a parallel ditty on Jefferson, which I think we can skip. And I'll just say that if we can no longer share Madison's and Jefferson's hopeful conviction regarding the progress of a capital T truth upon which political and religious freedom would ultimately converge, if we no longer share this earlier progressive rational confidence, then we must ask ourselves how best to honor, in our very different times, their orientation towards a universal truth. It is unsettling to recognize that the benefits of a secular political order derive from and ultimately depend upon the recognition of an authority beyond politics. But the necessity of such an authority is, in a way, a matter of quite simple logic. If there is no appeal beyond secular power, then that power, the power of the state, is in principle absolute. This logic of secular absolutism is playing out in our politics today, as religious freedom is reduced to an increasingly fragile exception to the enforcement of new lifestyle rights, including a right to the radical redefinition of marriage itself. These rights are demanded on no authority but that of an emerging majority, at least a majority of social and political elites, and a majority that has only come into existence since our current president was first elected. Such rapidly changing public opinion, driven to be sure by progressive media and by federal judges, is not apt to provide a very firm basis to any rights. Our first freedom, religious freedom, I suggest remains fundamental. I would propose that every defense of freedom implies some shared understanding of freedom in its relation to truth. There is no way to secure freedom independent of a shared understanding of truth, albeit an implicit and ever renegotiated understanding. Of course, it is natural, given the difficulty of articulating conceptions of truth regarding fundamental values that can be shared across deep cultural and religious differences, it is natural to wish for a conception of rights that might be defended as neutral with respect to basic beliefs regarding human ends or purposes, rights that would be valid for all people everywhere, regardless of their particular conception of the human good. But the defense and enforcement of any right implies a shared understanding of common purposes, explicit or not. As we debate the character of our laws and the implications of the social pressure to which Michael referred, the social pressure, I would say, always inherent in a regime of laws, we owe it to ourselves to think very carefully about what we can learn from the founders, as well as about how we must go beyond their thinking to address the challenges of our day. A vital question that can no longer be deferred is whether religious freedom is not inherently the first freedom. That is, whether freedom from the claims of the state does not depend upon a shared proposition concerning a truth beyond human power, a truth once referred to in terms of the laws of nature and nature's God. Thank you.